my contention is, and this is just speculation, is that he was testing Moses to see what Moses' reaction was going to be. That he was ticked off, yes, but he didn't really intend to go through with what he was saying. He wanted to see what Moses' reaction was going to be. And if Moses would have just, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, and submitted meekly, then he wouldn't have passed the test. But he understood the deeper meaning of God's sovereignty, and it's not just because I said so. And so I think, personally, I think this was a test for Moses, and I think he passed with flying colors. You also see this dynamics at work with Abraham, where he's bargaining with God over the fate of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And he sounds like an auctioneer, asking, well, if I can find this many people that are righteous, will you save them? Well, how about this many? How many? It's almost like an auctioneer bargaining. And so God, okay, yep. So this is radically different than what you see of a relationship between the pagan people and their gods. There is a concern, not so much for the assertion of will, but for the establishment of justice. Now, this is brings up the question again about how the sovereign authority is exercised. God granted the right for human beings to exercise sovereign authority over creation because he had that sovereign authority, and as beings created in his image, he granted them the right. So human beings have the right for sovereign authority over themselves. A prerequisite for dominion is self-dominion. So there has to be a bit of self-control in order to exercise dominion. You've got to be in dominion over oneself, which indicates self-government. So if God can grant his sovereignty over human beings, then it is feasible to assert that human beings are capable of granting their sovereignty to other human beings for the sake of practical ordering of society, and that seems to be what happens. That seems to be what has happened. The early Puritans took as an example of their for their view of government, the Israelites who were escaping bondage in Egypt. They were going from a situation where they had a ruler who considered himself to be a god, and they were under the rule of man, and they went into a situation where they established a rule of law. So they went from a situation where there was a rule of man and one single man, the Pharaoh, into a situation where they established a rule of God. The rule of law. It was under God, but it was a rule of law. And this was expressed by John Winthrop when he was talking about them establishing this idea of rule by consent of the governed, which was established in Egypt. But this idea that the rulers would rule by consent was expressed by the Puritan John Winthrop. It was about 140 years prior to the writing of the Constitution. He wrote a defense of the Court of Connecticut in the year 1637, which was the basis of the establishment of a commonwealth. It is clearly agreed by all that the case of safety and welfare was the original cause or occasion of commonwealth, and many families subjecting themselves to rulers and laws. From the premises will arise these conclusions. No commonwealth can be founded but by free consent. So he talked about many families subjecting themselves to rulers, but it has to be done by free consent. And so how do you establish the idea of free consent? You have the right to rule over yourself. For someone else to rule over you, you have to give consent to that. And this is expressed also later on in the Declaration of Independence, that government derives its just authority through the consent of the governed. So what is the mechanism through which we give our consent to be governed? And this turned out to be representative government. Now, there was a Fundamental Orders of Connecticut was the first modern constitution of its time. And this was, according to historian G.P. Gooch, this was drawn up in response to a 1638 sermon by a minister named Thomas Hooker. He gave this sermon before the General Assembly of Hartford. And he went on, his whole sermon was centered around the verse in Deuteronomy 1:13, where he says, "Take ye wise men of understanding among your tribes, and I will make them rulers over you." So he's making the argument that this verse in Deuteronomy asserted that God had ordained representative form of government as a means by which God gave his authority to us to have dominion. We give our authority to representatives. So representative government was considered to be a legitimate means by which we gave our consent to people to govern us. And that was back in the 1600s, long before the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. And so this notion that all of a sudden we had the Enlightenment and we recognized that we needed to be governed by consent is not really true. This notion is ancient, and it has, according to these the Puritans who developed these early constitutions based upon consent, the New England town meeting style of government was considered to be one of the most direct forms of democracy, and it was based upon the idea of the consent. And so it predates many of the documents that later expressed these that we're more familiar with, and they got this idea from the Genesis account. Now, the problem that some of them starting to see with the monarchy was that you didn't have this consent. And by the time of the Revolution, this viewpoint had become so prevalent and the basis for this viewpoint was so prevalent that when Thomas Paine wrote his pamphlet, Common Sense was a pamphlet that was distributed at the time of the Revolution, and it was largely accredited for generating the support for the Revolution. And in this pamphlet, Thomas Paine is quoting Samuel in 1 Samuel when the people came to Samuel and said, we want a king. And Samuel is really upset, and he doesn't like this idea. And he, it's against God's law. And God said to Samuel, let them have what they want. It is not me. It's not you that they are rejecting. It's me. Then he gave them a list of all these terrible things that are going to happen, and if they accepted a king. And this is something. Which it brings about another reason why, according to the Judeo-Christian tradition, sovereignty should be limited. Well, mankind has fallen, and our fallen nature has perverted this notion of dominion. So the exercise of dominion has, over and over again, resulted in tyranny. So the temptation for dominion is so great that even secular philosophers recognize it. Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, is quoted as saying that the most basic drive in human behavior is the will to power. So this is quite simply a result of the perversion of the notion of dominion. And it is another reason why sovereignty should be limited. So you have this notion that God is telling Samuel all these terrible things are going to happen to the people if they have a king, and how he's going to abuse his authority, and how he's going to make their men march off in wars that have nothing to do with justice and all. And then that is going to result in a perversion of justice. I'm paraphrasing it. But this was in Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense.